Hello, friends, and welcome back to Malicious Compliance Stories. Let's dive into today's story where a painter faced an uphill battle against poor decision-making. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with the turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. Painting disaster. How rust taught my boss a hard lesson. This happened about a month ago, and it's one of those moments where I felt like I was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. I work as an industrial painter, mainly painting machinery. Usually when I get a job, they tell me what kind of paint to use and the color, and it's pretty straightforward. But on this particular day, I was given an unusual and frankly questionable assignment. They told me to use water-based paint, latex, on a carbon steel job. Now, if you know anything about painting, you'd understand why this wasn't a great idea. I immediately went to my boss and told her that water-based paint on carbon steel was a terrible choice. I explained that it would rust the metal, ruining the paint job and possibly weakening the metal itself. But she was adamant. She said, "I don't care, just use the paint. They're going to be here next week." At that point, I had no choice but to proceed. I asked her to write down the specific paint I was supposed to use and signed off on it, just to cover myself in case anything went wrong. It wasn't ideal, but I figured I'd do my job as instructed. For anyone who doesn't understand the issue, putting water-based paint on rustable metal is a recipe for disaster. The water can seep into the pores of the steel, accelerating the rusting process. It not only ruins the paint job, but it could also cause structural damage to the metal over time. But I went ahead with it because that was the directive I was given. I did my prep work, which took a whole day. Then I painted the machinery and let it sit for a couple of days to dry and cure properly. A week later, my boss came up to me, visibly upset. She said the job looked horrible because rust was showing through the paint. I calmly reminded her that I had followed her instructions exactly, and I reiterated that water and air cause metal to rust, and the water-based paint was never going to work in this situation. We went back and forth for a bit, with her finally conceding that she'd been wrong, but then she asked how we could fix it. I told her that the best option was to sandblast the whole thing to remove the paint and start fresh with oil-based enamel paint. That would give the job the durability it needed and avoid any further rusting issues. She agreed to the plan and got me the sand I needed to strip the paint off the machinery. After all that, she finally seemed to trust me when I said some things just won't work. It took a bit of frustration, but in the end, we got the job done properly, and I was able to prove my point. Now, whenever I bring up a potential issue, she listens a bit more closely before dismissing it. It was one of those situations where I knew better, but I had to let the process unfold to make my point. At least now, I'm confident that my boss will think twice before making decisions without understanding the consequences. She's your boss and doesn't understand the process of prepping and using the right formula of paint to prevent rust? I don't think she needs to be the boss. Anyway, great malicious compliance here. You followed the instructions to the letter, even getting written confirmation to cover yourself. When everything predictably went sideways, the responsibility fell squarely on the boss's shoulders. And the best part? The experience actually taught her to listen. Eventually. And our second story. When Karen mistook me for staff while visiting my dad. My dad was skewered at a construction site by a large steel rod last week. I believe it's called rebar, but I could be wrong. He went to the hospital to have it removed and some surgery to repair damage to his internal organs. The next day, my husband and I drove to our hometown about 30 to 40 minutes away to see him after the surgery. My husband dropped me off at the hospital while he went to my parents' house to feed and walk their dogs and to let the neighbor know what had happened and why my parents wouldn't be home for a while. While visiting my dad, he said that he was thirsty. The IV drip that gave him liquids wasn't enough. The ice chips they gave him wasn't enough, so he wanted something stronger. So I left him to go to the nurse's station to see what he was allowed to have. My dad wanted a beer, but I was pretty sure they couldn't get him one in the hospital. So I went to the nurse's station and asked what he was allowed to have. They checked the patient notes and said he could have mild juice like apple, and that was about it besides water. I said thanks and walked down to the vending machine to get him an apple juice when this lady stuck a bunch of papers in my face and asked how to fill them out. I said, I don't know. She could go to the nurse's station to ask that. She replied with, the line's too long at the station and I'm here right now, so do my job and help her. I again said, they can help you at the nurse's station and that I don't work here. I'm just visiting. Because it seems to be mentioned often here, I was wearing nothing like the hospital staff. I had on gold leggings, a college sweatshirt, and it was obvious I hadn't fixed my hair. It was tucked under a baseball cap. The lady said, why won't you help me? Who's your supervisor? Stuff like that. While I kept insisting I was just a visitor and left to go bring my dad his juice. I'd been in my dad's room maybe 10 seconds when this lady burst in with her paperwork demanding I help her fill it out. My mom was frozen in shock at this lady while my dad was frantically pushing his call button to get help down here. I kept trying to dismiss this lady when an actual nurse came in the room thinking there was an emergency based on how often my dad was pushing his call button. The nurse said, what's the problem? And my dad said, this lady is bothering me and my daughter. The nurse calmly looked at the lady and said she'd be more than glad to help her at the nurse's station if she could please leave the patient and his family alone. As the nurse and the lady left, I couldn't help but mutter under my breath, I told you they could help you at the nurse's station, followed by some colorful language. Dad went home yesterday and seems to be in good shape, though Mom says he's kind of bored not being able to do any work around the house, like the lawn. He's supposed to stay in bed, and he has a very restricted diet. My older sister's flight gets in tomorrow morning, and then we're driving back to see him tomorrow after I pick her up at the airport. Wow, that entitled woman takes the cake. Who barges into someone's hospital room like that? Wearing gold leggings and a baseball cap hardly screams medical professional. I have to credit you for holding it together as well as you did. I'm not sure I could have stayed so calm in your shoes. That nurse deserves a shout out for stepping in and shutting the whole situation down, though. Nurses already deal with enough without having to babysit entitled people like her. And our last story. How I took out the trash and the neighbor. I live in England in a council flat managed by a housing trust. The house is divided into 2 flats. I have the upstairs flat with a small storage space downstairs and a front and back garden. My downstairs neighbor, Karen, has her own front door, 2 sheds in the back garden, and a back door leading to her yard. When I moved in last November, I thought it would be neighborly to introduce myself. Karen seemed nice enough at first. I explained my habits, like keeping the TV or music on all the time for mental health reasons, and asked her to let me know if it ever became an issue. She assured me everything was fine, and I felt hopeful about living next door to her. Oh, how wrong I was. At first, it was the bins. Karen's wheelie bin was overflowing with neon yellow bin bags, a strange choice that set her apart from everyone else using standard black bags. I didn't think much of it until I went to use my own bin and found it stuffed to the brim with her distinctive yellow bags. Annoying, but I let it slide. I moved my bin to the bottom of my garden near the gate to make it easier for me to manage and figured the problem was solved. That was until I got sick with the flu one week and couldn't retrieve my bin after trash collection. When I finally went to fetch it, I found it in Karen's garden full of her rubbish. My bin is unmistakably mine, covered in bright stickers. There's no way she could have accidentally thought it was hers. This was deliberate. I retrieved it, feeling both irritated and determined to put an end to this nonsense. Things escalated when I noticed her back garden. Karen's sheds were overflowing with bin bags, and the rubbish had spilled into the garden itself. She rarely put her bins out, and when she did, they were bursting at the seams. Recycling boxes overflowed with strange items, including dirty dishes. The growing trash pile was an eyesore, not to mention a potential health hazard. When Karen started throwing trash directly into the back garden instead of bagging it properly, I decided it was time to act. Being on the Housing Trust resident panel gave me a unique advantage. At a meeting, I casually brought up the issue, saying, will the trash pile affect the garden maintenance you promised? Without directly naming Karen, I planted the seed. Then I started gathering evidence, photos of the growing rubbish heap, her overflowing bins, and even her shed doors left open with trash spilling out. I shared everything with my housing officer, who visited my property under the pretense of assessing the garden for maintenance. He spotted the trash pile and issued Karen a warning letter. Her response? The rubbish was here when I moved in. Without proof otherwise, the Housing Trust planned to clear the trash themselves. But I wasn't about to let Karen off that easily. Determined to catch her in the act, I befriended the family next door whose garden bordered ours. They allowed me to camp out near their broken fence panel, giving me a clear view of Karen's back door. Over 3 days, I sat there, phone in hand, waiting for my moment. Finally, I hit the jackpot. Karen opened her back door and tossed out black bin bags onto the already towering trash pile. I filmed the whole thing, thanked my amused neighbors for their patience, and sent the video to my housing officer. Weeks passed with no updates, and I started to lose hope. Then one February morning, I was jolted awake by loud banging and clattering. Peeking out my window, I saw a white van parked outside, movers carrying furniture out of Karen's flat. I checked my email to find a message from the housing officer. "Thank you for your help. Final action is being taken." I made myself a cup of tea, planted myself by the window, and watched with a smug grin as Karen's belongings were loaded into the van. When the movers noticed me watching, I gave them a cheeky wave, my face full of satisfaction. Karen was finally gone. The housing trust cleared the trash pile, and a new tenant, a lovely young woman, moved in shortly after. She's polite and keeps to herself, and we chat occasionally when hanging out washing. Most importantly, she respects the shared spaces. As for Karen, I don't know where she ended up, but I do know this: if you're evicted from a housing association property, good luck finding another one. The lesson here: don't mess with my bins. Or me. I can't even imagine how someone could produce that much garbage. What the hell was she throwing out? I'm happy OP now has a respectful neighbor, but it's baffling to think about how much effort Karen put into creating problems instead of solving them. What do you all think? Could you deal with a neighbor like that? Or would you have gone nuclear sooner? Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.